Faiez Zannad will update us on the most recent, really breaking results from the long-term safety and outcomes phase of the BeAT-HF trial.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for setting the field so nicely. And this is a very unusual situation whereby this is the first ever trial you may have seen with this new paradigm from the FDA, whereby you have this interim look and two-phase with progressing seamlessly from what you have heard to mortality and morbidity. And I'm going to show you the result extension to morbidity mortality phase in the same trial. So basically this is some sort of same trial on behalf of the steering committee, and we have many of them here in this room. These results have been presented at THT in Boston by Mike Zile, and I am hopefully you will hear from me for the first time here. So you have heard about the rationale and design of this trial, and this results that I'm sharing today is the extension of the trial with many more patients, and throughout this expedited access pathway post-approval. Therefore, the device was available in the United States, but we had to keep the patient in, the same that you have heard from earlier on, and add additional patients. And these are the inclusion criteria. And you can see one typical difference here. The NT-proBNP was below 1,600 because, as per agreement with the FDA, post this early phase that you have heard, we found that patients above 1,600 didn't do so well with the therapy, so we've decided with the FDA to focus on only patients with NT-proBNP below 1,600 and to add more of these patients with this inclusion criteria. So this is the diagram, first phase, pre-market, you have heard about it, and the extension, which is the right-hand side, adding fewer more patients, and by the end of the day, the full group of the first cohort and second cohort of 163 versus 160. This seemed to be small numbers, but this was a high-risk category of patient, and we have accumulated more than 300 primary events, which is a sizable number in terms of statistics in outcome trials. And what is very important is the duration of follow-up, and you can see, indeed, there is a median of 3.6 years patient duration of follow-up in order to accrue the needed number of events. The baseline characteristics were not so different from what you have seen earlier because we have added a few more patients. And as a consequence of the inclusion criteria of BNP below 1,600, you can see the NT-proBNP wasn't so high, but all patients were class 3 New York Heart, almost 95%, and the event rate was really high. This means we are having here the most serious and severe patient. You can see the history and typical of a serious severe heart failure with reduced ejection fraction patient population. They were very well optimally treated. The trial was conducted before the advent of SGLT2 inhibitors, so no wonder there was nobody on SGLT2 inhibitor, or almost. But look at the ICD, almost 80% had ICDs. This means you shouldn't really expect much sudden cardiac death in this trial because they were very well protected against sudden death. Otherwise, the background medical therapy was great. Now, these are the study endpoints which were negotiated with the FDA. The primary endpoint was cardiovascular mortality and heart failure hospitalization, the very classical, and we aimed at 320 such events. And of course, we have the breakdown of the component of this composite event, the CV mortality, and we have explored a number of other endpoints. In clinical trials, we always struggle what to do with patients who progress to LVAD or what to do with patients who progress to transplant. Some analysis, and we elected to do so, lump this together with cardiovascular death, and we'll show you the result of this severe mortality or equivalent of mortality. And we have also looked at the subcomponent of heart failure morbidity, which is not only the classical heart failure hospitalization, but also the non-elective heart failure hospitalization and heart failure emergency room visits. We also have used a modern way to look at the entirety of the event and the outcome, which is the win ratio. using hierarchical composite endpoints, and I'll get to that in a couple of minutes explaining further. But the value of this win ratio is it takes into account morbidity, mortality, but also disability, safety, and quality of life, and exercise capacity and functional status, the totality of evidence. So this is the primary endpoint. You can see the curves almost did not diverge much. They seem to be diverging early on, but then they came closer later on. And as you may expect, the trial was neutral. There was no statistically significant difference between BAT and control on these hard endpoints of primary composite endpoint, CV, death, and heart failure hospitalization. Then we have used this hierarchical composite using win ratio. And typically, the value of this win ratio is that every single patient in the trial contributes. You may not know that in the survival endpoints, only patients who had an event contributed to the final result. Patients who go throughout all the trial not having had heart failure hospitalization or CV death do not contribute to the result. So, and yet they may feel better, having better quality of life or worse. And this is the value of this hierarchical composite using ratio, the win ratio analysis. Every single patient contributes to the result. And you can see here, indeed, that hierarchically we will consider CV death first if the pairs of patients, because every single patient is compared to the other equivalent in the control arm, and if in the pair of patients, one of the patients dies, then there is a loser and a winner, right? But if both of them survive, then we'll go to the next endpoint, which is whether they had a transplant or an LVAD. Same thing, winner or loser. If they don't, they are still alive and haven't had no LVAD, no transplant, we will go to heart failure hospitalization and down the road until we hit quality of life in all survivors, patients who are not hospitalized, but still are there, and they contribute with the event just by how much they feel better. And putting all this together, we have a ratio, which is called the win ratio, between the total of number of wins that Baroreflex stimulation got over the total number of wins for control. So it looks like this. This is the typical diagram of the win ratio. In red, you have the BAT therapy, and then the control is in blue. And you can see that the bar of BAT was larger, and expressed in win ratio is 1.26, and it may have a hazard ratio and also p-value, which was here significant of P004. I hope you get this important new way of looking at the result, which has now been applied in multiple heart failure trials. And you can see the components of this win ratio, whether it's mortality, morbidity, quality of life, the other contributors. You can see that most of the time the red bars are larger than the blue bars, and you can see how much any of the components contributed to the last event, and this you can see sizably every component contributed to the result, and this is very important. Now, if you go to the sensitivity analysis I have shared with you, which is the all-cause mortality and heart failure morbidity and quality of life extended to enroll the LVAD and the transplantation, you see the same tendency of 1.27 win ratio, 27% more patients on BAT1 on this computation, and this was statistically significant. And now we have also looked at the data, and these all are the secondary analyses. This is what we call clinical stability analysis. How many patients worsened or stayed alike or just improved? And the improvement worsening take into account the death, hospitalization, New York Heart Association, and you can see at the end of the day there are many more patients who improved on the BAT therapy, fewer patients stayed the same, and fewer patients worsened when compared to placebo. So all this goes in the right same directions. Now, freedom from all-cause death, LVAD, and transplant, we have created this new composite. You can see that this was marginally statistically significant, 0.054. I take it as very encouraging because the hazard ratio was 0.6. This means there is a sizable result, although it was marginally statistically significant. And the next slide shows you the rest of the softer endpoint. And the softer endpoint was the easy game to show. This is very simple, consistent with the first phase that you have heard from Joanne. Everything goes in the right direction in terms of quality of life. BAT was much better than control. In terms of 6-minute walk test, the improvement was much larger in the BeAT group, and so was the improvement in New York Heart Association. So anything on this quality of life evaluation went in the right direction in favor of BAT. So putting all this together, this is a thick sandwiches of layer of results. You can see at anything at the bottom, which are this safety and quality of life, exercise capacity, functional status, everything is the right direction, statistically significantly so. BAT is much superior to control. The middle is all-cause mortality and extended to be used within the win ratio, and you can see it's all also getting in the right direction, statistically significantly so. And the upper is the hard endpoint, morbidity, mortality, CV death, and heart failure hospitalization. And you can see the confidence interval was really large, and I will show you some of the results of this, certainly because the number of events were not that high, but there are other interactions, I will come to that later. Now, in terms of safety, I could have started with this. Safety was outstanding. The device was surgically implanted in an outpatient procedure. It is totally extravascular. We don't need a vascular surgeon. The electrode is just applied on the baroreceptors, and the safety, whether during implantation or after, was excellent. Very few cases, almost none, with inflammation or just healing of the wound. And we have looked at the data because, of course, this trial was conducted during the pandemic. So we have looked, as expected, and as anyone would have expected, and was the FDA will mandate to look at that, the interaction of COVID. And there are funny stories, and you have heard about this COVID interaction with many other trials. So if you see the cumulative event rate here, you have seen this slide before, but now this is expanded to have the heart failure morbidity, hospitalization before, during lockdown, and after. Funny things happened. During COVID, the control group stayed home and felt well. I did not get to the hospital. Of course, the patient on BAT, maybe because they felt they are less vulnerable or something, they kept being treated like usual and got to the hospital like usual. And there is a crossing of this curve. It's mysterious. We are digging into this, trying to find out why did it so, but you can see that stopping the trial before COVID, the trial would have been positive in morbidity mortality. So this is a funny interaction. We are looking into more detail and sharing this result of the FDA because they have developed ways to look at interaction with the COVID. Many trials expanded during the COVID area had faced this type of issue. So looking into this with the FDA. And the main confounders are potentially many. You can see here some hypotheses, and it is only speculation at the time being, but it's fair enough that we share the results as they are with you, and I leave you to guess what happened. We are still guessing. And finally, if you take this COVID interaction back in the figure that I've shared with you, the only change is the top layer, which is primary endpoint, and then you can see the confidence interval. If you exclude patient during and post-COVID, the confidence interval is so smaller, and then, of course, you may see a tendency to a positive trial. And, of course, I can humbly submit to you that this is kind of speculation, and we need to look at the totality of evidence with the FDA, see how to do with that. But still, there is lots to take home here. BAT did not, even though it did not result in statistically significantly difference in the primary composite endpoint of CV death and mortality, the freedom from all-cause death plus LVAD plus heart failure transplantation was marginally significantly higher in the BAT group, and the hierarchical composite endpoint of CV death, heart transplant, LVAD, heart failure hospitalization, quality of life, taking into account every single patient, analyzed with the win ratio, was significantly improved in the BAT group. Short-term significant symptomatic improvement that has been shown by Joanne were maintained long-term, and in the extent and in the individual magnitude effect. And the excellent short-term safety was also maintained long-term. So taken together, the results obtained during the long-term post-market phase of the BeAT-HF trial indicated that BAT was safe and had durable clinical benefit in patients with HFrEF. As you may know, the ACC/AHA have got this device already in their recommendation for improving quality of life and signs and symptoms, and the FDA has already approved on the result that had been shared by Joanne. Now these extension results are being submitted to the FDA, and we look how impactful this will be, including in the next set of guidelines. Thank you so much for your attention.